Welcome everyone to this little Q&A. We have with us this three CAs of BP Summer, Harish, Rosa and Tom, and we will be asking them questions around three main topics, which is preparation, the debate itself, and then a few questions on judging and how to judge. So to start from the beginning, questions on preparation. The first question is, in many debates, I don't know what the main classes in the debate will be. Do you have any particular strategy to identify what would those classes be?
Tom, we were literally discussing this just recently and you had the best answers.
Okay, so I think there are a couple of things that you should do. The first one, I think it's the easiest to implement, is the more you try and actively ask yourself, what are the main questions of the debate, the better you get at it, even if you don't do any of the next things. Just actively trying to think about it, putting aside a minute or two in the brainstorming or within your prep time to think about it, would make you better at it. But secondly, I think there are ways in which you can identify clashes in the debate. So I think the first and easiest way is just ask yourself, what is the other side going to argue about? If you think about two or three of the most obvious arguments, that would lead you in what are the clashes. Is it about what is the likely result of the motion, or are those results good, or is it a legitimate policy to enact in favor of the government? I also think, however, there are other ways that could be leading towards a clash in the debate. A, reading the words of the motion. Like, this House would allow to do something. Maybe we need to ask ourselves, when do we allow or disallow people doing different things? So I think a lot of times, different words and specific words in the motion also lead us towards different burdens or clashes within the debate. And lastly, I think that sometimes just asking yourself, what are the basic assumptions that both sides are likely to have in the debate might lead you in some ways to find what are the basic or the things that most teams are going to assume but might still be an interesting clash in the debate.
Yeah. So I guess I would just add to that is, I think the way we normally think isn't well predisposed to finding clashes. Now, you walk in a prep and the first question you ask your partner is, what arguments do you have? Which is fine, but you don't immediately think, like, what are the burdens and what are the clashes? I think that's partly just the way in which we've been conditioned to think when it comes to coming up with arguments or responses to almost any text or any kind of debate we have. One thing which I find quite interesting is many people still intuitively will come up with arguments which will speak towards those clashes. And one thing which I find to be quite interesting is if you sometimes work backwards. You have an intuition that this argument is relevant. Well, why? What are you actually answering? I'm not suggesting you should necessarily do that in prep time, though it can be useful to ask, why am I making this argument, and almost working backwards. But after the debate, I think if you also say, well, we won this debate with these three arguments, why were these arguments successful? It is much more useful in terms of training your thoughts as to trying to find those clashes. It's not difficult, it's just a different way of thinking than we are generally predisposed to do.
Okay, that's good answers to the first question. The second question is also for prep time, and it's related with modal and like building up the modal in certain motions. So they say that they saw this particular motion in the Oxford IV, which was in quarterfinals, related to that this House would criminally prosecute like the people in charge of the cities for the fact that people died in the street of homelessness. And the question is, when you face such a debate, which has not happened in any place in the world before, how could you do a good model and not being too over detailed on the model so that you're losing either time or being like doing things that shouldn't be done with the model? So on the model, and how should you build a model when you're OG?
I think often a good way to start, the perfect model is a model that never actually comes up again in the debate. So the ideal model is one which sets the debate so that you can have the arguments you want without coming back to the mechanism time and time again. So I think this is more for debates where you really are struggling with the model, for example, this debate, but oftentimes thinking about what do I think like the spirit of the motion is, what do I think the general arguments that should come out of prop and op are, and how do I just set up a sensible mechanism that would allow me to get to that point, because you don't want to be spending either a lot of your speech or a lot of your prep time obsessing over the model. That's not really the purpose of the debate.
Yeah, so the way I would think about that debate, and indeed many debates like it, is what I would normally do is within the first 30 seconds of prep have an idea of what the model is. I think it is then sometimes useful, and I think in this debate it might be one of them, where you're constructing your arguments, you're thinking about the other side, and then you come back to your model. In essence, what you want to be doing with your model is partly setting up advantageous territory for you, but there's real risks in doing that if you go too far. But what you really want to do is take away all those small arguments, the ones which are just really annoying and aren't about the core principle or practical arguments of the debate, and try and eliminate them to the degree you can, if you can do so reasonably fairly through the model. You won't necessarily be able to immediately find all of them, so it can be useful 10, 11 minutes into prep to come back for another 30 seconds to 1 minute to try and find the ways of sharpening your model to overcome those problems.
In relation to the same debate, there's a question into prep time. One Spanish team thought in that debate to counter-prop not civil liability, which was what the motion implied, but rather criminal liability for those mayors or corporate governments or whatever. How do you think that these counter-props should be assessed as whether it's a good idea to take them and play them out, for example, as opening up? And this particular debate, would you have done that in opening up?
So I think in this debate, that counterprop is seriously problematic, partly because it's not in and of itself mutually exclusive with a civil punishment. You can have a criminal and civil punishment at once. So you will place yourself in a very difficult position. Also because any defense you have of that counterprop will, 95% of the arguments will be a defense of the prop. So all you're asking is, if the judge doesn't immediately invalidate it, the next speaker will go, you have agreed with all of our principles, all you want to do is potentially extend it to criminal punishment as well. An opening government team may not even need to play ball with that and immediately knock you out of the debate. So that is a very dangerous and potentially illegitimate counterprop in that case, because you don't have any mutual exclusivity.
Okay, and extending the question on counterprops, have you done this often in debating in your experience? And if not, why? And what would you think would be like the main reasons that we don't counterprop that much often in the debate?
I think one big reason people don't counterprop, and often it's not a bad strategy, although that's not always the case, is largely because you're essentially just doing double the work you have to do. So not only do you have to be a good opposition, but you effectively also have to be a good proposition. And you kind of just, in most debates, don't have time to effectively do both. I think people often confuse suggesting alternatives, which imply that the prop isn't the only option, with counterpropping. You can have a few lines in your speech saying there will be other alternatives to this motion, so this isn't our only option, without necessarily counterpropping. And I think sometimes teams just go too far into explaining specifically why some of those alternatives will be better, when really, most of the time, the main burden you need to prove is just that the prop option isn't the only option to reach a good outcome.
What I would say is, I mean, there have been times when I've counterpropped, and I probably shouldn't have, in that it is sometimes a good idea to counterprop with a less stringent but nonetheless mutually exclusive version of the prop. The positive of doing so is that you place the other side in a very difficult position. The negative is that you have ruined the debate, in that the grounds which people will argue both on your side and the other side have been seriously limited. And that is incredibly risky, and only in some cases you'll get away with it. What I would say is, the much more common case where you will use a counterprop is to do something much more extreme in the opposite direction than the government, to create a more clear clash, or to make yourself more principally consistent. That can be fine because you're not really narrowing the territory of the debate and you're just creating a level of consistency there. My general rule would be, it is rarely going to be the case when it is beneficial to counterprop, except in cases where the status quo cannot be defended at all plausibly, or it will be very difficult to defend the status quo. But even in those cases, you have to be very clear about why your solution is mutually exclusive with the other side. And then you need to do a very careful redundancy check to make sure that the arguments you are making and the arguments you are rebutting don't effectively hit each other and contradict each other, which is a real risk and happens quite a lot if you haven't really carefully thought about your counterprop, which doesn't happen if you end up being much more extreme in the opposite direction. So that may sometimes be the most likely way of having an effective counterprop.
Okay, last question on prep. They say that there's a particular team which asks that they have a problem when doing prep for closing half. Basically, the problem consists on that they do the same thing that when they're in opening half. Hence, when they arrive to the debate, most times they find themselves in the position that they have very good arguments, which are already explained in the debate. And the question is, do you have any particular technique that you change when you're in closing half to think of the arguments, regardless of what will happen then in the debate, adaptation, blah, blah, blah? What happens during prep? Do you think different? How do you think? What do you do in order to do a good closing half?
Imagine we all might have slightly different answers to this, so I guess we
Yeah,
could
okay.
all...
So I think the first thing to say is that regardless of your strategy, the fact that you have twice the time to think about arguments leads to having more arguments. Like if you're opening, after 7 or 8 minutes, you should start writing your speeches and you're no longer communicating. You have the advantage of 7 or 8 more minutes, plus some time in the debate itself, to come up with those arguments. But then I think there are a lot of strategies you can try and implement in order to just come up with more arguments. Some of them are somewhat similar to what Harish said before. You have an argument. Think to which clash it applies. Think if you have other arguments within that clash. Think if that clash is maybe part of a larger clash. And then maybe it's like part of this practical question, and you think there are other sub-clashes within that. Then, again, do the opposite, it's just like trying to find the arguments within each one. You found one, try to do the reverse again. So it's not easy to implement, it's like a general way to try and think about coming up with new arguments. Secondly, and I think that happens a lot, some people just have blind spots. They just like have specific things they just tend to miss. They don't tend to think about how does it make systematic changes to like the way in which, I don't know, the criminal justice system works when we have this sort of motion in place. And just like have a list of things you tend to forget is a lot of times useful because those are your blind spots, and if you just eliminate them to a large extent, you find a lot new extensions. There are probably more things to say that I can't come up with right now, but that are clever prep strategies.
Yeah, so it's an interesting question because there isn't a very straightforward answer to it. One thing which I found can be effective, and it partly depends on how much you trust your partner, but hopefully you trust your partner a reasonable amount, is that when you're in the top half, one thing which I have a tendency to do with whoever I'm speaking with is actually go through and construct the argument. So prove why it's true, go through the impacts, go through the logic of it. I think that is much less useful in the bottom half. That you can trust, because you have more time, that between you and probably more the person doing the extension, that they will be able to construct and explain the argument. So give large parts of the analysis behind it. What that allows you to do is spend a bit more time thinking and just spreading out for more potential arguments which you will be making, which can be useful because rather than spend the time working out the analysis, work out the potential breadth of the motion. And then in the debate, the thing which I would be looking to do is if you have enough claims, and if the motion is sufficiently deep, not always the case, but hopefully the case more often than not, you will have new material, you will have new things you are adding, whether that's analytical or an entirely new clash, but more likely just new arguments answering a current clash. Your question in the debate isn't even how do we prove this particularly well, obviously you need to do that, but it's can we find the reasons why this is so important? What is the reason why this is really adding value to the other, to what our opening half has already done? Because the biggest difficulty I find teams run into is in a debate, we spend a lot of time thinking about what the other side is saying. We spend a lot of time working out how we rebut the other side. And that's natural, it's just the way the format works. But we spend a fraction of that time thinking about how we beat the top half. And if during the debate you already have some of those arguments down, you can have one of the two of you, the extension speaker, building the arguments, you then do have the time to go, these are the 3 things we have which is new. That isn't going to win us this debate until we can explain why this is a significant and important contribution. And that is what I think you then do in the debate, because you already kind of know the kinds of arguments you're going to run, and hopefully at least some of them, and most of the time at least some of them remain.
Okay, there's one more question which is linked between preparation and debate, which is, do you do anything particularly different when you're prepping a final? So is there any different on preparation, or do you just do the same prep that any other debate?
For me, exactly the same, in that this is not the best answer, but it's the way I think about it, which is it's nice to have an audience and it's nice to win over the audience. But in reality, you need a majority of the panel, and that is it. And maybe they respond slightly to the way the audience responds. So if you really want a slightly more rhetorical introduction, include it. But in reality, most judges judge a very similar way. So I would prep a very similar way to how I would anyway.
I think there's no like strict strategic need to prep any differently. I mean, obviously the only difference is you really can't take a second in a final, but you're kind of never trying to do that anyway. I think the only way I would ever change prep is kind of mentally. So if I don't have an audience that's just judges, I wouldn't worry particularly about an introduction. Whereas if I have an audience, I would usually prefer to have that written out, but I think that's pretty much entirely personal preference. So sometimes I know some people like to have a lot more written out for a final just because it makes them feel a lot more comfortable and allows them to get into their normal flow better. But I think that's just how comfortable you feel in front of an audience. It's not a strategic consideration.
Great, so let's move to debating questions, as in what happens in the debate. So the first question is, do you have any particular strategy to POIing? In particular, I've seen Harish, so this is directed to you, doing POIs, and you tend to be like stay quiet, and you seem to be like really calm down during a POI. So do you have any particular strategy to POIs, or how do you do them?
So I think underpinning that is what you want to do with a point of information. And there are lots of things people do with a point of information which I don't think are often that productive. So there was a tendency, still is a tendency, to ask outlandish hypotheticals with obvious answers, which people do on the hope they get some kind of concession, but they never really get a concession from it. They'll get an answer, and the other speaker could easily just say, I mean, that's obviously not analogous in this case, so I wouldn't end up doing that. What I find is what you need to do with a point of information is further your case. It is never going to be advantageous or rarely advantageous just to restate what you have already said. You can assume more often than not that the judges will have picked it up. So what I think you are looking for, and what I think you want to do with that point of information is, how do I further the case? That might be partly that you want to rebut a key contention another speaker has made. You may want to respond to a response to your own case, or you may just want to re-emphasize parts of your case with the additive reason of why it still matters and outweighs the other team. So I think it does depend a little bit. The strategy will be very context dependent, but it is what you're trying to get out of it. At least for me, is I think you are rarely going to get massive concessions from the other team, though on occasion that works. So it's more just about furthering your matter. It's an extra 15 seconds to speak. So I think use those 15 seconds to add more analysis in the context of how the debate played out.
Guys, anything to add?
So I think like the two main things I'll add is, one, I always write down my POIs when I'm planning to win, like maybe in a debating session when I'm practicing no. Like I have 15 seconds to explain, to convince the judges I won another team. That's not a lot of time. Like it's almost non-existent. I have to be precise and sharp and control exactly what I say. And I can't just like make it up from the top of my head when I stand up. So I always write them down because those 15 seconds are just very precious and you don't get them again. You have one shot like in this scenario and you can't waste it. So I think making sure that you think about your POIs thoroughly, write them down, ask your partner for thoughts, corrections, rewrite them again. It is a process that people don't do enough and they really should do most of the time.
Anything else?
Yeah, I think the final thing with POIs, which to be honest I think just crossed over a lot of the stuff from before, is that most of the time, at least if you're speaking after you give the POI, you always want to think that in an ideal world you could use that interaction or that response to a POI later in your speech to further your own case. And I think kind of what was said before about restatement, but if you think you're going to get asked the exact same question and get the exact same response, then you might as well not be standing up at all. If you can't later incorporate it into your argument and you don't know why, you should always know what answer you want from that and what you want to get out of it. And if you don't have that in your mind, at least in an ideal world, then you should be asking a different POI.
Yeah, and I guess just kind of bringing some of that together, is I do think there is a tendency for people to be overly reactive with POIs, which is respond to what is happening immediately in the debate. which is okay but not ideal. That you want to get something out of it, which is probably more than responding to a subsection of an argument or an example another team has made. And you see this, like speakers will get up angrily when they hear something silly from the other side. More often than not, they don't then get accepted. But if they do, they're probably just going to respond to a very small part of the case. So you do need to then think about what do you want to do with this. And it does need to, and ideally would be more prepared. As Tom says, one of the best ways of doing that is writing your POI down.
Very good. There's a question on choosing what to rebut or not. So the question is, when I'm member speech, I find very difficult to decide whether I should rebut many things or not, try to integrate them or leave them to my partner in the whip. So what would you advise to a member speech as whether he should rebut, not, or what to do with rebuttal?
Okay, that is a difficult question to answer without more specific information. What I would say, there's a few things I would say. The first one is, and it comes back to thinking about the clashes in the debate, which is what is vital in this debate. If another team has an argument which is vital to answer one of those clashes, such that you need to negate it, you should be negating it and should probably be doing so in your extension speech itself. You will probably still get credit for doing it in the whip, but often you probably get a little bit reduced credit, even though I'm not sure technically whether you should or shouldn't. It depends a bit on the specifications underlying it. It is always going to be difficult to respond to everything which is said. If you have a reasonably good team in front of you, particularly, you have lots of teams now who just matted up large numbers of arguments. The key, I think, is when they're going through their speech, look at their argument and say, what are they actually trying to do with this? If it is not responding to a core burden, you don't really need to respond to it. If it is, then you do. And I think it's just, again, identifying what they're trying to do with all their arguments and then working out which one of those you can accept. If you don't respond to an argument, effectively, it's more likely they're not going to stand in the rest of this debate. If you cannot live with that, or you're likely to lose the debate because of that, then you should be attacking it, or as well, there are going to be things which could be just so easily responded to. Have the line to respond to them, because you might as well hedge your bets in some of those cases.
I think, like, one of the most important things to do in an extension is always to explain why that extension argument is relevant. Otherwise, it's just a random other idea. So I think this is definitely not true all the time, but as a general rule, when thinking about whether rebuttal is really vital to be in the extension speech, think about, if you're explaining why this argument is important, would I have to take down this other argument or weigh it off with this other argument to explain that it has value in the debate? And if you do, you have to include that piece of rebuttal. But you don't necessarily have to include it at the beginning as rebuttal. You could include it at the end of that point when you're explaining why that point is so significant, especially because obviously in extension it is a real balance between engaging with other teams but also making sure that content is out there. So if you are the kind of person who's going to get carried away rebutting it, I would include it at the end. But basically, if it's important to explain why this point is new or significant, then you do have to include it in extension in most cases.
I don't have a lot to add because I just mainly agree with what you said before. I just like to clarify maybe a couple of things. So I think there are no general very good rules of thumb, but I think that it's true that you should probably answer parts that are vital for your case specifically. Like, even if it's an important burden in the debate, if you think it's crucial for your case, then you should probably prioritize answering that. The second thing is just ask your partner. Like, if you're unsure, maybe just talk with them. Do they feel comfortable answering to the DLO, or do they think they need more time to win your OG and you should spend a minute more answering to the DLO? And I think that, like, as a general rule, I think that most of the time when I debate, I tell my member speech to not listen to the leader of the opposition to the extent in which they can actually rebut them. I don't think it's worth the time. So most of the time, rebuttal to the DLO would be something that the member of government would do. When responding to the LO is usually redundant, just not worth listening thoroughly to that speech, when you should probably just write down the extension or some parts of it at that point.
That's really interesting. There's one question related with what Rosa just said about framing and the very first part of your speech. The question is, I've seen some very good debaters spending something like a minute in the beginning of member speeches, framing out how the extension will play out on the debate. The question implies A, should we do that in our member speeches, and B, how do we do it in the best way possible? They give an example of Dan doing this in round robin, and an example, but that's irrelevant. So would you frame?
So I think that the answer to the first one is, like, in 90% of the cases, yes. It most of the times you come up after four speakers, two from each side, who have only added material to the debate most of the time. If you don't clarify to the judge why you're talking about what you're talking about, you are more likely to risk it seeming insignificant and just losing the attention from the panel, seeming repetitive. That 1 minute or 30 seconds of explaining what's happening in the debate to some degree and why your contributions are going to be important, I think is crucial in a lot of ways to help you win the debate, even if there's a weak speaker afterwards who can do all of that job. I think it also helps you to know for yourself that what you're talking about is important. It's a good mechanism to enforce yourself to make sure that you're talking about the important things of the debate necessarily, because you have to explain that at least shortly why that is true. As to the why, I think that it's a complex question. How should you do framing? I think that you shouldn't do it for too long. I think that like 30 seconds to a minute max, given that you still need to prove the points afterwards. But you want to do the minimum amount of work necessary in order to make sure that the judges understand like the basic notion of why you would win the debate if you've proven the point. Maybe not entirely. Maybe you haven't shown that really some of the things that were discussed in the opening half are happened on their both sides, and the whip speaker would do that. But you have given them a reason to think about why your extension matters, at least to enough of a degree so they wouldn't disqualify your material as insignificant.
Yeah, I guess what I would add to that is effectively the purpose of framing is to say, at the end of the debate, this is what the judge should care about. Ideally, you can do that very quickly by going, this is what the judge should care about, these other arguments are marginal or irrelevant. There will be cases where the most contentious part of your extension or your speech is going to be that part, that these other arguments are limited in importance in the real world, and this is the actual important part. Those are going to be rarer cases, but it is plausible that is going to be the case. One example of this would be if you imagine a very good top half team before you, which has covered the vast majority of points, and you have a new addition on top of it, but one which is not clearly more important than what they're saying, and it isn't easy to explain that in a single sentence or two. It may be the case that you need to spend 2 minutes going that this is what matters the most, this is why it matters the most, which is both framing and argument. So it really depends on how loose you think the term framing is. So it really does depend. Generally the rule would be, unless it's really going to be argumentative and really going to be contentious in the debate, you don't want to spend a great deal of time doing it, because if you spend a great deal of time doing it, you don't have time to actually prove the argument. But when the contentious part of the argument is going to be the framing, that's when you may need to spend more time on it.
Also, I think just the final thing to say on that is, firstly, I think how much framing you do is often dependent on who you think you need to beat. So often, if you think you need to beat your opening team, that framing would be much more important than necessarily if you kind of think the opening team might already be out or weak to a certain extent anyway. So it is definitely about strategically reacting in the debate. And I think the second important thing is that often you do see teams that kind of cross the line from comparing themselves to the opening team to just essentially wasting time explaining how the opening half of the debate went. So you do need to make that comparison, but I would just say, if your framing is taking 1 minute and 30 seconds, really think about whether that whole thing is framing or whether the first 20 seconds are just a blow by blow of what happened in opening, because if you're just kind of repeating what went down already, that's not really contributing to any argument you're making.
Okay. Next question deals with a team that said that they're struggling to get above a certain number of points because they think, like speaking points, because they think that even if they're able to get very good arguments in debates, they lack skills to deepen the analysis further than would just be like, why is it true, why is it important? So they ask, is there any particular thing that you do when you have a good argument to deepen the analytic, like the logical analysis that underlies the argument?
Yeah, so I would step back for a moment and ask, why do we need any analysis at all, or why do we need analysis? And there are two reasons. One, which is fairly straightforward, which is you need to convince a judge that in a vacuum your argument is true. Now that's fairly straightforward. You can do that more often than not in a couple of sentences. The bigger one is that you want to make your argument stand up to challenges, either ones which have come out, or more likely, which could come out from other teams, even not the teams you're directly across from, potentially from the best potential version of the op. And then when I'm thinking about how to do analysis, it's always, how would I respond to this claim I'm making? What is the other side likely to say? And then what you're doing is you are building a case dealing with the potential redundancies, which the potential redundancies perhaps, but more importantly, making sure it can stand up to a fairly large degree of scrutiny. And if your argument can stand up to lots of theoretical challenges, it's probably pretty well explained. That's the first thing, the first two comments I would make. The other thing I would say is there are tendencies for teams to, rather than do proper analysis or explain why an argument is true, to do numerical analysis. You will have 5 reasons, none of which are overly compelling. And that happens a lot. It's not actually, sadly, a terrible strategy, because most judges say, oh, you have 5 reasons. One of them is probably reasonably well explained. But one hint I would make at that point is, if you find yourself that you have several mechanisms as to why something is true, it's not terrible, because then at least if one gets knocked down, you still have others in place. But make sure you have at least a couple of them which are fully well justified. And yes, you can have the other ones because you want to hedge against bad judges. But that can be a useful thing for you to do. But don't be fooled when another team does that to you as well.
So I think I'll add a couple of things, though not all, because I think most of it was covered in Harish's answer. So I think that generally, if I try to deepen my analysis, what I think about is not necessarily how to prove a point, but more in the lines of what can I say that is interesting regarding that point. So I can think of a bunch of reasons a point might be true, but is there anything particularly interesting and novel and new that I can say about the topic that might end up being a point by itself, or just that I'll spend most of my time on those 2 sub-points that I found that are interesting and deep, and not like the obvious ones that came to my mind. The second thing I'll say is that most people just spend most of their time in the wrong place. It's easy to analyze something, and then we start writing down our speech, and we just give 5 reasons, maybe even 5 good reasons, maybe they're analyzed adequately, of why something that is obviously true is true, or something that is obviously good is good, but we don't analyze on the hardest parts, the ones that are most likely to be in contention. So I think that once you do the process of thinking, where would I argue with myself? Ask yourself, where are the most important parts to analyze? Not the ones that it's easiest for me to come up with the answers to that, because most of the time the reason it's easy is because it's obvious, nobody's going to argue about that. But what are the areas in which it's hardest for me to convince another person, whether it is the oppositions, who will never be convinced, or the adjudicator itself? Those are the areas that are most important and are most likely to be exploited by the other side if they are smart. Spend your time there, and your depth of analysis would matter more, because you spend less time on things that are obvious and just not in contention and don't add any benefit to the debate.
Yeah, and I guess it's worth knowing that that's clearly how you should do it. It's never the easiest thing to do, and that part of that takes you understanding this intuitively. I think the core of lots of parts of debating is none of it's complicated if you do it enough times, and if you're always thinking about what is contentious. Sometimes you are going to be wrong, but that's fine because you still have the right thought process in place. And then at a point, it will all become considerably easier because lots of it becomes intuitive, was learned to be intuitive. Paradoxical phrase here, but it's more you think about it, more you're thinking in the ways of what is contentious and what is not, more that becomes second nature, and you'll be better at spotting what is likely to be attacked.
And I'll just add one last thing. I think a lot of people mention why their arguments are important, but don't actually analyze why they are crucial in the debate. I think not a lot of teams, definitely not in opening halves, actually make the effort to explain and give an argument that explains why, given that they have proven that this argument, they should win the debate. why it's such an important issue, to what extent they've proven that harm, or why they just, other teams can't win the debate without responding to that. And I think most teams just stop at the point like, this sounds relatively important and bad, or good, depending on which side they are, but not actually making the effort of analyzing to what extent it is important and whether judges can't ignore that argument no matter what. I think this is somewhere a place where adding the analysis might be crucial and important, and people, again, don't do it because it's harder than doing the easy part of proving why it's true.
Yeah, I think actually most teams do get to a point where they explain why an argument is important, but it's explaining why it's important to that specific debate. And I think that most of that analysis is important to take it from that generic point of why something is theoretically significant to why it's significant within the context of that very specific motion that you're debating.
There's a question related with the topic you just mentioned on impacting. There's a twofold question, which is first, in most workshops I've seen about impacting arguments, they just explain things like try to select the type of collective that is affected and try to detect why it is important to like each of those people groups, blah, blah, blah. But it's hard to me to do that in a debate. How do I impact better my arguments is the first question. And the second question is, can I win an opening team by impacting the argument they've made? Or is it contingent on the logic of the opening and hence I cannot win that class?
So let's start with the second part first, to which the answer is yes, but. So you could definitely, it really depends on what the top half team does, because there's a way of looking at that to say both teams are contingent on the other. The opening is contingent on the impact. If that impact does not exist, presumably that argument may be true, but is of marginal importance in the debate. At the same time, if the argument is not proven to be true, i.e. done more from the top half, it doesn't matter how important it is going to be. There is no clear guideline for how a judge will distribute credit in that case. The best potential way around it, if what you're doing is impacting, is oddly to explain why that impact matters, or what the likely default is absent the impact which you are giving it. It is risky, but it's certainly something which can win you the debate, particularly if you do it well, even though, yes, both sides, both opening and closing, are to some degree contingent on each other.
Okay, and so the first part of the question, more over than the think of which groups are affected, do you have any particular technique on impacting, and how would you do that analysis on impacting? We all know how to analyze whether something is true or not. Do you have any particular technique on impacting arguments?
I think just the very first quick thing to say on that is when people say you should identify the group that is affected, I think people often try and reach for some group that isn't obviously in the debate, when actually it's usually just the general people who are involved in the debate that come up in prep. So it's not that you have to search for some secret most vulnerable group that's hidden within the depths of the debate. You just have to think, who are the relevant parties to this debate? So it's not really something you have to necessarily come up with at the last stage during the debate itself. It is to a certain extent implicit in the debate, and I think thinking of it I have to find an affected group tends to lead you down quite a difficult path. But if you just ask yourself questions right at the beginning of prep, what is the problem? Who is affected by this problem? How many people are affected by this problem? That kind of leads you to the type of people that you should be talking about. And it's often not one cohesive group of people. And I think obviously there are lots of other ways to analyze impact, but even if you do want to think about it in terms of groups of people, you don't have to think about it as who is this group I'm looking for?
Yeah, so I think in some ways, impact is kind of the wrong word to use in this case. What you want is a reason why this argument means a great deal in the debate. One way of doing so is just purely that numerical way, or which groups are affected, how much they're affected, but there are other ways of doing so as well. Very much contingent on what's happened before and what your argument is. Just to highlight a few of them. One would be to explain why your argument is analytically prior to what has come out before. Why the arguments which have been made before, either by the proposition or the opposition, are reliant on the claim you are making. And that is one way of saying this is the most important thing. It isn't an impact in the literal sense of having this impact on individuals, but is nonetheless showing your argument as more important than other arguments in the debate because it comes before all of them. There's a limit to how far you will take that, because there are times when that can sound utterly absurd. Imagine a top half team which notes hundreds of thousands of people will die, and you go, but prior to that, we must prove that death is bad. I mean, obviously that is probably not going to be very effective, but that is kind of way of thinking about it, which is what needs to be true for what's happened before us to still be useful. It's a different form of impacting. There are lots of different ways like that. The core is just to ask, why should this argument matter a great deal in the debate? Some of it will be numerically what the outcomes are. Often it will instead be that arguments made before or since are going to be contingent on this claim.
So I'll add two small things. The first one, and the more theoretical one, is that people often forget that each argument should end up in the result of you should accept the motion if you're a government team, or should oppose the motion if you are an opposition team. If your argument doesn't lead to that conclusion, if you don't finish your argument with a sentence, and this is why you should accept the motion or reject it, then you haven't done the full intent, the full job that you need to do. Impacting is usually what we call that sort of analysis. Like, we've proven a claim is true, now I want to prove why given that claim you should oppose the motion. I think this sort of thinking about it, this sort of like mind framing, is all the time very useful to understand what exactly is it that we're trying to do and which method might be useful. The second thing, and I think it's just like a way of again trying to think maybe even easier as the top half team before you've heard other arguments to impact, is a couple of things. Firstly, if you think you know what are the likely clashes or arguments from the other side going to be, just explain why they are more important preemptively. Like, even if oppositions prove X, Y, and Z, given that we've proven A, we still win the debate. But secondly, just ask yourself, in general, when we're asking ourselves questions similar to the questions that rise in the debate, what do we care about and how do we decide upon that? And then just explain in advance why your considerations are the ones that matter the most within the debate, above other considerations. Sure, you don't know what the closing team will do, but now they have to engage with that framing and with that weighing. Maybe they'll prove your points better, but you can obviously never do anything about that. But you are impacted your arguments in a way that matters within the debate, as in explaining why they're relatively more important than other things in the debate, rather than just chasing higher and higher numbers and impacts abstractly or like in a vacuum.
Yeah, I guess just to add one caveat to that, which is one time where you will often be making an argument where the conclusion will not be, as a result, you should support or oppose this motion, is when you have a permissive moral principle. By which I mean, imagine a debate about limiting free speech. You may argue on prop that it is reasonable to limit free speech if these conditions are met. That is effectively an argument, but that isn't an argument to support the policy unless you can prove those conditions are met. Which is to say, I guess with almost everything we're saying, these are general rules. Never take a rule overly seriously, because there are going to be cases where there will be exceptions to it. So similarly, like the ideal outcome of any argument is, even if we lose every other argument in this debate, we still win this debate because of this. Don't take that too seriously, because you can sometimes sound absurd if this tiny point you are making ends up with a 30-second attempt to show it is the only thing in the debate which matters. So think of everything as a general rule rather than an absolute rule.
Just to emphasize that caveat, because I think it's important given what I've said. It happens, it's not that unoften that you have arguments that are on the way to the clash. Anything regarding characterization, for example, would never win the debate by itself, but might be necessary. Every time we have a clash about what is the comparative in the debate, that would never win the debate by itself, almost never. But you still need to make it in order to win the debate. So not all arguments necessarily lead to, therefore you need to support or oppose the motions. But when you're talking about specifically impacting, if it's not clear that you have to prove that argument in order for other arguments to even exist in the debate, then you should probably strive that your arguments end up in, and this is why you should accept the motion and support the motion.
Also, just the final thing to say on that, which is just a really simple thing. Sometimes a good way of practicing impacting, often it's really difficult to think in a vacuum why your argument is important. So often a good way of practicing it is trying to explain why it would be more important than an opposition point or a closing point, just because most people find it a lot easier to impact when they have something to compare it to, and quite difficult when you're just existing in a vacuum only with your argument. So I would say if you want to just in training practice impacting, usually by comparison is an easier way to start, because otherwise it does become quite abstract.
Okay. There's two more questions on debating, and I'm gonna have one on judging. The first of the two questions on debating is for whip speeches. They ask first, when you do a strategy as in clarifying questions to order the speech, like to give order to your speech, do you decide those clarifying questions before the debate, during the debate? How do you do that? And if it's during the debate, how do you order the arguments, given that you probably already have notes taken and you didn't know the questions you're going to clarify the debate through? That's the first part of the whip question. So then I'll go to the second part.
So I think, actually, this is a very bad response. Like, I've literally talked about this in the workshop I'm given here like 2 hours ago. I guess what they mean is like what the questions, like the titles of our questions or the clashes by which we're going to summarize. And I think that there are definitely rules I wouldn't break. Regarding what specifically was asked, I think it's generally a bad idea to decide on the clashes in advance for a couple of reasons. A, you don't know what your opening team is going to run. You don't know what the oppositions are going to run. Debate is a dynamic game. There might be 10 different clashes in a debate, but actually the way developed, there are just 2 or 3 that are important to deciding the debate. So the process I usually do is during the top half of the debate, I take notes and notice what are the important clashes. Sometimes it might be the case that I thought in advance about a clash that none of the other teams talked about, and I can explain why it wins the debate. But again, it needs to engage with what already happened. So for example, if nobody talks about the justification clash or the legitimacy clash, I might be able to prove why it wins the debate and therefore use the clashes I have from the prep, but it can only happen once I'm inside the debate and know what actually happened and know how to engage with the rest of what happened within the debate. I also think it's crucial that your extension fits those clashes. You don't want to spend 3 minutes talking about a clash, a point of contention that would decide the debate, in which you have no contribution of yourselves. Remember that there are always different ways to divide the debate into clashes. There's never a single way to think about it. There are almost always different ways to think about the debate and frame it through the use of what clashes we're going to sum by. Choose the ones that are also beneficial for your side. Regarding the last thing about like note-taking, I just copy the one sentence of the argument from the other team and whatever I had to say about it before into the right clash, explain why my extension engages with that, wins that idea, and make the comparative inside the clash.
Yeah, so I guess to emphasize one thing is there are clashes, but under each clash there could be lots of mini clashes. So as the debate goes on, there may be a specific argument about the harm caused to society, which is going back and forth in the debate. And that is a clash, it's just a smaller order clash, and the big one, which is this policy harmful for society overall or not? And I think it is useful as the debate goes on to start noting what those are. You don't necessarily know what the major clash is, but as you hear the debate, people may spend a lot of time on one of these sub-questions. That could be a very important sub-question, it may not be. I find it to be quite useful when it comes to your notes, if you have that down. What has the opposition said? What has the government said? What is your contribution to each one of these? And why is your contribution vital? And then I think later, as the debate progresses, you work out how you group these, which is what is the meta question this is answering? And sometimes you're going to dump one of these argument clashes entirely. More often than not, it will feature in some way in your speech if time has been spent on it. But just remember that, which is there are clashes about individual arguments, which isn't what we really mean when we say a point of clash, but they fit under a much broader question of what are the burdens, are we answering that burden, and what are the arguments which fit under it. And I think you will always be wanting to track what people are saying about these minor arguments, but you may need to spend a bit of time later in the debate working at what the clash underpinning all of that is.
The last question on debating is for all the three of you, and it's an interesting question, which is, we've just watched the exhibition debate, clarification for the online viewers. There's just been an exhibition debate in which the three of them were present, and they asked, if you could do the debate again, what would you change in the strategy of your team in order to be more probably that you win the debate? What would you change of what you did?
Okay, I think I'll start. I think there are a couple of things I'll do differently. And this answer is going to be irrelevant if you haven't actually watched the debate because it's going to be very about the specifics of it.
It'll be uploaded, so they could watch it.
So I'm just saying, if you don't want to watch an hour of an exhibition debate with people who haven't debated for a long time and never with each other, just skip my answer right now because it's going to be very specific about what I've done, and also I might be wrong about what I think I've actually done and what actually happened in the debate and what people understood from my speech.
Yeah.
No, but it's important because it's a very specific question about a debate that happened. But like at the moment my speech ended, I thought about what should I have done in order to win the debate more clearly. So I think in my case, it's not necessarily about the case of our two models, like strategy-wise, what I should have done, specifically as a whip speaker, is a couple of things. The first one is, I think, given the way that debate has developed, should have spent more time just explaining why the questions I'm winning are more important than the specific contributions given. So I've done that to some extent, but regarding, for example, all the contributions from government teams on why we just create a more equal world, I could have spent a minute explaining why the harms we present are just more important, why we just usually prioritize each individual children and their happiness over that, why the sort of benefits they create are less important than the harms. Anything that of that sort would have been very beneficial for us as a team, given that we don't engage at all directly, except for like rebuttal, but none of our cases are about those sort of questions. The second thing is I probably should have done more in differentiating exactly why our contributions are important in the cases of like the parents versus upbringer. And the third thing is I think that like what strategically was the worst part of our extension is that we don't actually prove the full extent of the harms that we want to prove. So we prove some bickering between like these children. We don't actually prove destructive hatred between them. And proving that extent is hard, and I should have prioritized in my speech doing that more. It's easier when I don't get responses, but I should have spent more of my speech doing that probably, given that I think this is the most important, given that I think you win the debate solely on that.
Yeah, so it's an interesting question because it's very hard to separate this from what happens after your speech. And there is obviously a limit to what degree your strategy could be affected by things which come out later, which obviously would affect it and would affect the arguments made. It's a bit of an odd way of thinking about it. But I think there's a couple of things which I would flag to begin with. The first one of these is we spent a reasonable amount of time on the notion of inequality, which closing opposition try and note as incidental in the debate. And actually, the way in which closing opposition would do that was relatively clear in a point of information, even if that wasn't necessarily as clear as it would later become. And while I think there are parts of the speech which are robust to that, it very much depends on which one of these models or how exactly this community organizational work or these communes will end up working. And I think it could have been more clear had we been taken the strongest version of what the opposition would say or the likely version of what the opposition would say and had spent more time explaining how our arguments apply even in that case. Because I think some of that is left implicit rather than explicit. So I think that's the first thing I would say. The second part of that is when it comes to a lot of what happens afterwards, which is looking at the individual basis. Well, effectively what I think happens a lot in that debate is whether closing opposition can win or not is, do you believe that this is a huge effect which can outweigh any of the arguments which the proposition said? Because I think there's a lot of stuff going back and forth. Lots of it in the bottom half isn't actually rebutted greatly by either side. It is just a question of prioritization. What we definitely don't do is when it comes to that question of the individual is give strong justifications as to why our claims about the influence on the child matters so much. It is very much constructed as a responsive claim to opening opposition rather than a big constructive point. And what that effectively allows is closing opposition to sidestep from it and go, here is our big effect. We don't even need to deal with all the small parts of yours because you haven't given us a reason why that ends up being more important. So by focusing more on creating an argument which was responding to opening opposition, we didn't quite do enough to show why our argument is actually a huge impact in and of itself and therefore needed to be dealt more by closing opposition?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, especially if you're an opening team, it's very difficult to think like strategically what you would change, because you're just like, well, I'd say everything that was said in closing. That's what I do. But I think like the two things, firstly, the first thing, which like isn't a very sexy thing to change, but I think the structure could have been improved a lot. I think we left a lot of not open goals, but easy places for CO to come in on arguments that actually had been. That actually has been started by opening opposition. So for example, like a lot of the stuff that we talked about like survival of the fittest and how children will have to compete, we didn't obviously take it as far as the closing opposition team, but that was all in the case. And I think probably like without hindsight, we wouldn't have known necessarily to extend that, but I think we could have structured the speech more to highlight that a lot of the premises of those arguments had existed in the early stage analysis. And I think firstly, some of that could have been front-loaded to the PM speech, because I think the way we strategically saw the debate, the PM speech got a little bit wound up in kind of the red herring of economic inequality, which it was pretty clear from reasonably early on was probably not going to be the core of the debate, but we kind of got locked in that top half clash, which I think had that been minimized, we could have front-loaded more to the PM speech. And I think secondly, yeah, the main strategic thing I would change is just obviously a DLO speech kind of is primarily rebuttal, but you usually want to frame it as being constructive to highlight that it's not just kind of scattergun responses, but more steps of analysis. And I think strategically, I didn't do that particularly well. And that's a really, like framing responses or rebuttal as arguments within themselves is a much better way to highlight that it's been said, because judges just kind of ignore rebuttal more in general anyway, whereas if you tell them it's an argument, they're going to listen to the way you talk through that. So I think we could have just explained our arguments in a more strategic way, even if the content kind of was floating around.
I'm going to say something that isn't a response to that question, but is important to say. I think that's a great question you should ask yourself after each debate. Ask yourself, what should you have done in order to move up one ranking or win the debate? Not in the sense of, well, I could have run all of the other cases, but given that you didn't know in advance what's going to happen, what could you have done differently? What should you have done in the speech? What should you have done in prep time? So that the next time you have this similar debate, but with different arguments, you would win the debate. If you are capable of giving a good answer to that question, that is essentially the same, at least in terms of practicing to improving, as winning the debate itself. It doesn't matter if you won the debate. If you know what you should have done and what could have done in advance in order to win the debate, and not in the way of, well, I know all the arguments, so I know how to rebut them, because you can always say, you should have run that argument better or rebutted it better. But give yourself a tool in order for it to prevent that sort of thing happening the next time. I think you should always ask yourself that question, and I think you should be happy once you have an answer for that, as happy as you would have been if you won that debate. At least when you're prepping and training. Like, obviously, if you are in the final of a tournament, that's less value.
Also, I think, just quickly on that, a really helpful thing to do is if you keep your notes, think about how you could present the case better with the exact same arguments. So just think about how could I have spent more time on this, or like moved this around in a different way. So purely from a strategic perspective, imagining I came up with the exact same content, how could I have done better just within that? Because you obviously can do other things to kickstart more arguments, but often when debaters get better, they don't necessarily think of new arguments. Like if you ever taught kids, they come up with so many brilliant arguments that you'd never think of. The main difference between like you and the kids is often just like the strategic idea of what you do with those. And often after a debate, you think that you thought of stuff you didn't. So if you just go back to the notes and look at what was actually there and think about how you would rearrange that now, that's helpful, because often strategy training becomes just content training, and it's often really hard to find stuff to do to just work on strategy. So if you just use old content, that can be helpful.
So one thing I would add to that is thinking about your case is the most important thing you can do. Thinking about other people's cases is also very important, in that there are only so many arguments that are going to be run in debates. Like, there are very few entirely new creative arguments. There are very few which you'll come up with in 15 minutes. There are some, but it's rare. And if you hear another argument from another team which is good, or the genesis of a good idea, it is fine for you to steal it and ask yourself, how would I make that better? Indeed, that is just so valuable. You will be up against teams which are sometimes better than you, sometimes as good as you and who just get a good argument you hadn't thought of, worse than you and may hint at a good argument but not fully make it. Well, how would you have made that argument? What would you have done with it? How would you have framed it? It is not as important normally as how you would improve your own case, but it literally increases the amount of arguments you have by an awful lot, right? And that will be lots more material you have, lots more arguments, a lot more for you to improve on. So it's always about you and improving yourself, but part of that will be taking the best things from others and improving what they do.
And the last remark on that, promise, last one. If you can actually know at the end of the debate, given the good arguments you've had, like the creative one that you didn't think of before, ask yourself, how could I have come up with that argument? What sort of thought process leads me to think about that argument? That makes it more likely that you won't only think about this specific argument in a similar debate, but that the thought process that leads to those creative arguments you're likely to recreate in other areas. So again, if you can generalize it to some extent, like obviously not how can I think of good arguments, but like, is there something specific I don't think about when I think about debates of this sort or debate in general? Then again, this is going to have significantly more value in your ability to create similar arguments in different debates, which just don't sound necessarily the same.
Okay, guys, so that would be basically the questions. That's 1 hour video. So thank you very much, the three of you. And if any have any further questions, I'm sure they'll answer through whatever social network you might find them. So thank you very much, guys, and see you in the next Happy Summer.